It is just after dawn, June 19th, 1944. A pale sun climbs over the expanse of the Philippine Sea, its light fractured and scattered by high clouds and the lingering haze of humidity. The waters are a deep cobalt blue, deceptively calm. Far out in the western Pacific, hundreds of miles from any shoreline, the ocean is alive with steel, smoke, and purpose. The Japanese aircraft carrier Taihō, pride of the Imperial Navy and the newest jewel in its carrier fleet, cuts a clean, deliberate wake through the open water. Her sleek silhouette is unlike any of her predecessors. An armored flight deck stretching the length of her hull, a towering island structure to starboard, her flag snapping in the light wind. Beneath that ensign stands Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese Mobile Fleet. It is the morning of the largest carrier battle of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and Taihō is at its center. Ozawa's ships have steamed for days to reach this position. Now, the air is alive with the roar of engines and the smell of aviation fuel. The carrier's deck crews, clad in color-coded vests and headgear, sprint between aircraft, their shouts lost in the thunder of radial engines spooling up for takeoff. The mission is clear. Strike the U.S. Fifth Fleet before it can destroy Japan's hold on the Marianas. The stakes are nothing less than the security of the home islands. From above, the flight deck is a mosaic of activity. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo planes, and the sleek Mitsubishi A-6M5 Zero fighters are marshaled into position. Plane handlers use bright paddles to guide each aircraft forward. Ordnance crews secure bombs and torpedoes beneath wings and fuselages. On the island bridge, signalmen scan the sky, watching the circling combat air patrol. Below them, the navigation bridge hums with quiet efficiency, the ship's position, speed, and course relayed constantly to Ozawa's command post. Beneath decks, engineers tend to the 8 steam turbines, the heartbeat of the vessel, driving her through the sea at over 30 knots. Taihō is more than a carrier. She is the statement of a navy refusing to accept its decline. The heavy armored deck above the hangars is designed to shrug off the kind of bomb hits that sank Akagi and Kaga at Midway. Her design is meant to make her a survivor, but survival in war often hinges on the unseen. Beneath the surface, many miles ahead of Taihō's path, another hunter stalks these waters. The USS Albacore, SS-218, is a Gato-class submarine on her 8th war patrol. Under the command of Commander James W. Blanchard, she has been operating north of the Marianas, tasked with intercepting Japanese forces reinforcing Saipan. The Albacore's crew, hardened by months at sea, are cramped within the steel cylinder of their vessel, hot, humid air mixing with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of machinery. Shortly after 0730, the Albacore's sonar operator catches a distant rhythmic thrum through the hydrophones, the combined beat of multiple large propellers. The contact is huge. Through the periscope, a sharp silhouette breaches the mirage on the horizon, a massive carrier flanked by destroyers. Blanchard and his men realize they have stumbled upon the heart of the Japanese Mobile Fleet. The periscope lingers on her profile, the tall island structure, the distinctive armored flight deck, and Blanchard knows this is no ordinary prize. This is the flagship. Blanchard issues calm, precise orders. The Albacore maneuvers into an attack position, sliding beneath the swell, her engines switching to electric drive. Inside, red lighting bathes the control room as men work at plotting tables and the torpedo data computer, calculating target speed, course, and bearing. Depth is adjusted, Trim tanks shifted to steady her at periscope depth. The Japanese escorts are vigilant, but Taihō's speed and commitment to launching her first wave of strikes keeps her on a steady heading. Blanchard knows he will get one chance, perhaps only seconds to fire before being forced to dive deep and evade. At precisely 07:45, Blanchard gives the order. 6 forward torpedo tubes cough in succession, compressed air propelling their deadly cargo into the blue. Each steel cylinder leaves a white wake, slicing toward the carrier. Aboard Taihō, lookouts spot the wakes. Shouts of warning erupt. The helm swings hard over. Throttles are adjusted. Above the roar of engines, a young pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Sakio Komatsu, makes a split-second decision. His Zero is airborne, gear barely up. He banks sharply, aligning with one of the streaking wakes below. With the sea rushing past, he dives straight into the path of the torpedo. His aircraft strikes the water just ahead of it, a blossom of spray and debris, and the weapon detonates prematurely, Komatsu sacrificing himself to save his ship. The other torpedoes fan out. 4 run wide or are evaded, but one, the fourth in the spread, runs true. It strikes Taihō on her starboard side, roughly amidships, with a deep, resonant thud. The carrier shudders. A muffled boom rolls through her steel frame. Below the waterline, the torpedo ruptures aviation fuel tanks, flooding a compartment and tearing open internal bulkheads. The ship's engineers react instantly, isolating damage, counter-flooding to correct a slight list. The carrier maintains her speed, the flight deck above still launching aircraft into the morning sky. From the bridge, Ozawa is informed. The hit is serious, but not crippling. Taihō was built for this. Her armor and watertight design have prevented catastrophic flooding. On the surface, it appears she has shrugged off the attack. But below decks, invisible danger begins to spread. Gasoline from the ruptured tanks seeps into surrounding compartments. The volatile fumes, heavier than air, drift into ventilation ducts. Slowly, inexorably, they begin filling spaces far from the site of impact. In the hangars, ground crews continue to service aircraft. Mechanics tighten bolts, refuel fighters, and arm torpedoes. Unseen, the faint odor of fuel becomes stronger in certain corners. It is dismissed at first. The smell of a busy carrier during operations. Damage control teams report localized flooding and ruptured fuel lines. Ventilation is increased to clear the fumes, a decision intended to make the ship safer. But in the Taihō's design, this spreads the vapors through passageways and compartments that had been free of them. Above, the tempo of operations continues. Fighters claw into the sky to cover incoming strike waves, while dive bombers and torpedo planes vanish toward the east, hunting the American fleet. Hours later, a single spark, from a switch, a motor, or the backfire of an aircraft engine, will ignite those fumes. The explosion will tear through the armored carrier, sending her to the bottom on the very day of her first combat. For now, the steel decks glisten under the morning sun, and the crew does not yet know they are living inside a slowly ticking bomb. The unseen predator, Albacore, has already slipped away, diving deep to evade the depth charges now being rolled off the destroyer's sterns. On Taihō, the battle still rages in the air. Below, the ship's fate has already been sealed. Japan's ambitions for Taihō had taken shape long before she ever touched salt water. In the years before her launch, the Imperial Navy had been searching for an answer to a problem that cut to the heart of its survival: the catastrophic losses at Midway in June 1942. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had gone to the bottom in the space of a single day. Each had been vulnerable to the same fate: bombs penetrating their wooden flight decks, igniting hangars crammed with fueled and armed aircraft. The result had been uncontrollable infernos and rapid destruction. The shock of that defeat was still etched into the thinking of every senior naval officer in Tokyo. Construction orders for Taihō were placed with this lesson foremost in mind. She would be the first Japanese carrier to feature an armored flight deck, capable of withstanding the kind of direct hits that had gutted earlier designs. Her hull was laid down at the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe in July 1941, at a time when Japan's war was expanding rapidly into Southeast Asia. Although warship construction took priority, the demands of other naval programs and the shortage of critical materials, especially high-grade steel, stretched her build into late 1943. At 29,300 tons standard displacement, she would be the largest carrier Japan had ever produced, even heavier than the famous Shokaku class. From the keel up, she was a warship meant to endure punishment. The flight deck was plated in 75 millimeters of hardened steel. Beneath it, hangar decks were subdivided by armored bulkheads to limit the spread of fire. Her aviation fuel system was designed with the latest protective features known to Japanese engineers: double-hulled storage tanks and CO2 fire suppression systems. Below decks, her machinery spaces were arranged for maximum protection against torpedoes, with heavy transverse bulkheads and void compartments along the waterline. In theory, this combination of armor and internal subdivision would allow her to survive multiple hits, maintain flight operations, and remain in the fight where other carriers would be crippled. The Imperial Navy envisioned Taihō as the natural flagship for its rebuilt carrier strike force. Her top speed of 33 knots, delivered by 8 Campon boilers feeding 4 geared steam turbines, allowed her to keep pace with fast escorts or reposition rapidly during battle. Her air group, up to 65 operational aircraft, would be composed of the latest fighters and attack planes, giving her a potent offensive punch. An expanded suite of anti-aircraft guns, including a dozen 100mm Type 98 dual-purpose mounts and over 50 25mm Type 96 automatic cannons, bristled along her flanks and island. These were intended to blunt American dive bomber and torpedo bomber attacks before they could strike home. By late 1943, Japan's naval leadership had pinned high hopes on this single ship. Admiral Minechi Koga, Yamamoto's successor as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, saw Taihō as more than just a replacement for the carriers lost at Midway. She was to be the vanguard of a revitalized mobile fleet that would restore Japan's naval dominance. Yet this optimism masked the sobering realities of Japan's situation. While Taihō's armored design addressed the specific vulnerabilities exposed at Midway, it could not solve the deeper problems: dwindling numbers of experienced pilots, shortages of aviation fuel, and an industrial base incapable of matching America's shipbuilding tempo. Her completion was further shadowed by the shifting balance of naval power. By the time Taihō entered service in March 1944, the United States had launched a dozen Essex-class carriers, each with far larger air groups than Japan could muster. The American submarine force was also strangling Japan's sea lanes, cutting off the flow of oil, rubber, and bauxite. These pressures meant that when Taihō finally sailed, she would be doing so with an air group composed partly of fresh graduates from accelerated training programs, brave men, but with only a fraction of the combat seasoning of the veterans lost in earlier campaigns. Still, the symbolism of her commissioning was powerful. Her sea trials proved her fast and stable, her armored deck a smooth expanse of steel under the Pacific sun. Photographs from this period show her immaculate, her paint fresh, the gold chrysanthemum crest gleaming at her bow. The Japanese press, tightly controlled by the military, presented her as a technological marvel, proof that Japan remained capable of building capital ships that could match anything afloat. Only a handful of senior officers knew how precarious the reality was. In April 1944, Taihō joined Carrier Division 1 alongside the veteran Zuikaku and the light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda. Vice Admiral Ozawa, chosen to command the mobile fleet, made her his flagship. His mission would be shaped by Operation A-Go, the decisive battle plan designed to halt the American advance toward the home islands. Taihō was to be at the center of it, her armored deck the shield behind which Japan's last trained carrier airmen would strike. The months of training and preparation that followed were rushed and tense. Each sortie, each takeoff, was practice for the confrontation everyone knew was coming. By early June, word reached the fleet of American landings on Saipan. Ozawa's orders were clear: sortie the entire Mobile fleet and destroy the U.S. Fifth Fleet before it could consolidate its hold on the Marianas. In the shadow of her armored deck and steel flanks, the crew of Taihō prepared for battle, confident that their ship could take whatever the Americans threw at her. None could imagine that her first fight would also be her last. The USS Albacore had been prowling the Pacific for nearly 2 years before her fateful encounter with Taihō. She was a Gato-class submarine, one of the workhorses of the U.S. Navy's undersea fleet, and by June 1944, she was in the hands of a crew that understood the rhythm of silent warfare. At 311 feet long and displacing over 1,500 tons submerged, she was cramped and utilitarian, a steel tube packed with machinery, torpedoes, and 80 men living in shifts between duty stations and narrow bunks. Her skin was scarred from earlier patrols, but her systems were in fighting trim. Commander James W. Blanchard, a steady and calculating officer, had brought her through 7 war patrols already, earning a reputation for patience and precise attack execution. Albacore's mission for her 8th patrol was specific and dangerous: to take up a position north of the Marianas and intercept any Japanese naval forces moving to relieve the islands. Intelligence from codebreakers had indicated that Japan's mobile fleet would sortie if Saipan was threatened. If that happened, submarines like Albacore would form the first line of ambush, spread across likely approach routes. The patrol area was deep ocean, no islands for cover, just endless water where sound traveled for miles, and an inattentive captain could miss his quarry entirely. Life aboard was a continuous negotiation between endurance and readiness. The temperature below decks hovered in the high 80s, humidity clinging to every surface. Diesel fumes and the smell of unwashed clothes hung in the air. The constant drone of machinery formed a background hum, broken only by the clatter of the galley or the occasional metallic slam of a watertight door. The men moved in well-practiced patterns. Every bunk was shared in shifts, every meal eaten quickly, every watch taken with the same disciplined focus. Conversation was often short and to the point. On patrol, words were spent like fuel. Blanchard's officers knew the strengths and weaknesses of their boat intimately. The Gato class was robust, with a crush depth beyond 300 feet, but she was not invulnerable. Japanese anti-submarine escorts were equipped with increasingly effective sonar and depth charges, and even a single well-placed bomb from an aircraft could end a patrol abruptly. For attack, Albacore carried 6 forward torpedo tubes and 4 aft, loaded with the latest Mark 18 electric torpedoes and the still-used Mark 14 steam torpedoes. The electric models ran without leaving a telltale wake, but their speed was slower. The steam-driven types were faster, deadlier on impact, but betrayed themselves with a visible trail. On June 13th, Albacore had slipped into her assigned patrol sector, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and refresh the air, submerging by day to listen. Sound was her greatest ally. Trained sonar operators could distinguish a merchantman from a warship by the number of propeller blades and the spacing of their beats. The crew's vigilance was unbroken. They all knew that somewhere out there, the Japanese fleet might already be moving. The early morning of June 19th began like the others. The boat lay at periscope depth, the surface a few dozen feet overhead, engines silent, running on electric motors. Then the sonar room reported faint, rhythmic pulses, multiple screws, heavy, powerful, approaching steadily. Within minutes, the signature grew stronger, resolving into several distinct contacts. One, the largest, bore the unmistakable sound of a major capital ship. Blanchard raised the periscope briefly, careful to avoid betraying their position with the glint of glass in the morning sun. Through the eyepiece, he saw it. The towering shape of a carrier, massive, flanked by destroyers and cruisers in a tight screen. The carrier's bow cut through the water cleanly, the plume of her wake white against the deep blue. Her profile was distinctive, an armored deck, a tall island superstructure, lines too modern to belong to anything but the newest of Japan's fleet. The captain's mind moved quickly. To close in on a carrier surrounded by escorts was a near-suicidal undertaking, but the potential reward was unmatched. A single successful strike could alter the course of the coming battle. Orders went out in clipped phrases. Come to attack course, adjust speed, trim the boat for firing depth. Men moved to their stations without a word wasted, the tension palpable but contained. The approach demanded precision. Japanese destroyers were sweeping ahead and to the flanks, their sonar probing the depths. Any mistake, a premature periscope exposure, a noise from the hull, would bring them thundering down with depth charges. Blanchard opted for a bow-on intercept, threading the Albacore through the moving arcs of the escorts. Every few minutes, the periscope came up for a quick look, then slipped below the surface again. As the range closed, the immensity of the target became undeniable. This was no Shokaku or Zuikaku. This was the Taihō, Ozawa's flagship, the most powerful carrier Japan had ever put to sea. The realization settled on the crew like an electric charge. In the torpedo room, sailors loaded the tubes, checked gyro settings, and stood ready for the command. In the control room, the fire control party fed constant bearing, range, and speed updates into the torpedo data computer, a mechanical brain of gears and cams that would decide whether their spread would find its mark. Every man aboard understood the stakes. In the narrow space between chance and disaster, the Albacore moved into position, her bow slowly swinging onto the firing line. Somewhere above, on that massive flight deck, aircraft were taking off for the first strikes of the battle. Below, the hunters prepared to strike first. ChatGPT said, by the opening weeks of June 1944, the Japanese Navy had already committed itself to a gamble from which there could be no retreat. The Marianas had become the linchpin in the Pacific theater, a chain of islands whose airfields could bring the home islands within range of American B-29 bombers. When U.S. forces landed on Saipan on June 15th, the alarm bells in Tokyo reached a pitch. Operation A-Go, a long-prepared decisive battle plan, was put into motion. Its premise was rooted in the pre-war doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval thinking for decades. Lure the U.S. fleet across the Pacific, bleed it through submarine and land-based air attacks, then destroy it in one climactic carrier battle close enough to Japan's own bases to sustain the fight. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet was the centerpiece of this operation. 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, would sail with hundreds of aircraft and a heavy escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. At its heart, Taihō, with her armored flight deck and modern systems, would carry Ozawa's flag. Alongside her steamed Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, and a cluster of light carriers, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, whose smaller air groups would supplement the strikes. In total, the Mobile fleet would bring roughly 430 carrier-based aircraft to the fight. But the plan's elegance masked deep flaws. Japan's carrier air groups, shattered in earlier battles, had been rebuilt in haste. Many of the pilots were graduates of accelerated training programs, with only a fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts enjoyed. The attrition of experienced airmen in the Solomons and Central Pacific had left the new squadrons without the hard-won instincts that could make the difference between survival and loss. Even so, their orders were absolute. Engage the U.S. Fifth Fleet, cover the land-based bomber strikes from the Marianas, and cripple American carrier power in a single operation. The Americans, under Admiral Raymond Spruance's overall command and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's operational control of Task Force 58, were already in a position to dictate the tempo of the coming battle. Intelligence units had cracked enough of Japan's communications to know that the mobile fleet was moving. They understood the timing, the composition, and the intended axis of advance. While the Japanese believed they were sailing into an ambush of their own design, the Americans were waiting with overwhelming strength. 15 fleet and light carriers, over 900 aircraft, and surface escorts, unmatched in number or radar-directed firepower. The geography of the Philippine Sea further tilted the odds. This was deep, open water, with few navigational hazards and no coastal cover. Here, the range of an aircraft was the decisive measure of power, and U.S. carriers, with their larger complements and more capable fighters, held the advantage. The Japanese plan depended on striking first, from beyond the range of American retaliation, using their longer-legged aircraft to deliver crippling blows before retreating out of harm's way. To make this possible, Ozawa's fleet had to close the distance without suffering attrition from submarines. Yet the submarine force was already in position. Days before the carrier engagement, U.S. boats like USS Kavala and USS Albacore had been vectored into the likely approach routes. Their commanders had explicit orders: target carriers above all else. For the Americans, sinking even one Japanese carrier before the main air battle could open would be a strategic windfall. On June 15th, Ozawa's mobile fleet departed Tawi-Tawi anchorage in the Sulu archipelago, steaming through the Philippine Islands into the open Pacific. The voyage was a test in itself. Fuel shortages forced reduced cruising speeds, and resupply was impossible once committed. Every ton of fuel carried aboard the carriers and their escorts was irreplaceable. Still, the morale aboard Taihō was high. For many in her crew, this was the first major sortie aboard a ship they believed to be unsinkable. 4 days later, the fleets were on a collision course. The Japanese still believed their advance was masked by the vastness of the sea, but in reality, American submarines were already shadowing their path. Ozawa's fate, and Taihō's, was being shaped not in the air, but in the cold, silent depths far ahead of his flagship's bow. June 19, 1944 broke over the Philippine Sea with a sky of layered cloud and pale light filtering down to the endless expanse below. The air was still, the water deceptively smooth. Beneath the surface, USS Albacore lay in wait, her hull trimmed for periscope depth, silent on electric motors. Inside her control room, the dim red lighting gave the impression of a place perpetually between night and day, a space where time was measured not by hours, but by bearings, ranges, and courses. At 0730, the sonar shack reported the sound again. Multiple sets of screws, heavy, evenly spaced, and closing. It was the sound of big ships. Commander James W. Blanchard stepped to the periscope and brought it up slowly, careful to avoid the telltale glint that could betray them. Through the narrow lens, the horizon rippled in the morning haze. Then, like a shape materializing from a mirage, she appeared. The lines were unmistakable. The high, clean profile of a modern fleet carrier, flanked by a screen of destroyers and cruisers. Even without identification guides, Blanchard knew this was the target every submarine captain dreamed of, a capital ship of the Imperial Japanese Navy's main battle force. He watched her for only a few seconds, enough to note her speed and heading. She was driving hard to the east-northeast, her bow cutting white spray, an aircraft warming up on her forward deck. Beyond her, columns of escort ships churned the sea to foam. Each one was a threat, armed with sonar and depth charges, each alert for precisely the kind of predator Blanchard commanded. But she was worth the risk. This was the flagship, Taihō, newest and largest carrier in the Japanese Navy. Sinking her could tilt the coming battle before the first bomb fell. Blanchard gave the order to set up an attack. The fire control team worked quickly but methodically. Bearings were called out, ranges checked, the carrier's zigzag pattern tracked and plotted on the attack board. In the forward torpedo room, men stood by, the metallic tang of lubricants and oil in the air, each tube loaded with a Mark 14 steam torpedo. The choice was deliberate. Steam torpedoes left a visible wake, but their speed and explosive power gave them the best chance against an armored hull like Taihō's. The approach was tense. Albacore's bow eased into firing position, threading between arcs of the destroyer's patrol patterns. Any closer, and the sound of her screws could be picked up. Any slower, and the firing solution might slip away. Blanchard's voice remained calm, giving course and speed adjustments in short, precise commands. Each time the periscope rose, it was up for seconds only, a brief flash of the target's angle on the bow, her position relative to the escorts, the state of the sea. At one point, the carrier altered course slightly, her wake curving in the blue. Blanchard adjusted instantly, bringing the boat's bow around to keep the firing angle within limits. Sweat beaded on brows in the close air of the control room, though no one moved unnecessarily. The sound of the carrier's screws grew louder, deeper, a steady thrum that resonated in the steel walls. The moment came when the range was closing fast, and the target's aspect was nearly ideal. Blanchard took one more look through the periscope, then lowered it. "Stand by. Fire 1." The boat shuddered as compressed air launched the first torpedo, then the second, third, and on, 6 in all, each leaving a trail of bubbles streaking toward the Japanese flagship. Aboard Taihō, lookouts spotted them almost immediately. Alarms rang out. The helm swung hard over, engines roared to increase speed. On the flight deck, aircraft in various states of readiness stood vulnerable, crews frozen for an instant at the sight of the white tracks cutting across the water. Then, from one of the circling combat air patrol, a Zero pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Sakio Komatsu made an unthinkable choice. Banking sharply, he dove his fighter into the path of one torpedo. There was a brief flare of spray and debris, then a deep concussion as the warhead detonated against his sacrifice. 5 tracks remained. Most were thrown wide by Taihō's maneuvering, but one, its bubble trail unwavering, struck home on the starboard side, roughly amidships. The explosion reverberated through the carrier's hull, a dull, heavy shock that lifted her slightly in the water. On Albacore's hydrophones, it was a sharp crack followed by the rumble of internal damage. Blanchard ordered the boat down. Deep dive, silent running. Pumps thudded, valves hissed, and the submarine slid toward the black depths. Above, destroyers were already moving in, their wakes boiling as they began to drop patterns of depth charges. In the minutes that followed, the Albacore's crew listened to the battle above in sound alone. The hammering blasts of depth charges, the fading thrum of screws as the escorts hunted along a widening arc. No one knew then what exactly the torpedo had done to the Japanese carrier, only that the shot had been true. In the gloom, Blanchard allowed himself the smallest nod. The attack was complete. Now they had to live long enough to hear the result. The impact shuddered through Taihō from keel to mast, a deep, resonant blow that made the armored flight deck quiver underfoot. Men on the bridge felt the deck lurch slightly, followed by a slow, rightward list that leveled out within minutes. Below the waterline, the torpedo had struck on the starboard side, just forward of the island structure, punching through outer plating and rupturing aviation fuel tanks. The blast flooded compartments and sent a shuddering vibration through the steel ribs of the ship, but the carrier's designers had built her to take such punishment. Watertight doors slammed shut. Counter-flooding began to correct the heel, and the propulsion plant kept churning at full speed. To most aboard, the immediate impression was that the ship had weathered the attack. Ozawa received the damage report within minutes. Flooding was under control, machinery unaffected, and speed maintained. To a commander who had studied the fate of Akagi and Kaga at Midway, this was confirmation of Taihō's value. Her armored deck and compartmentalized hull had done their job. Flight operations continued without pause. Fighters roared off the deck, bombers were armed for the next strike, and the sea around the carrier buzzed with activity. On the surface, she was still the unbroken flagship of the Mobile fleet. But deep inside the ship, the torpedo had started a silent chain reaction. Aviation gasoline from the shattered tanks seeped into surrounding compartments, spreading slowly into bilges and void spaces. The liquid itself was dangerous enough, but more insidious were the fumes, vapors heavier than air, invisible, and capable of drifting through any open conduit or ventilation duct. Damage control parties moved through the affected spaces, noting the odor, but trusting the ship's systems to keep the air clear. The standard response was to increase ventilation to disperse the fumes, a decision that would prove fatal. On the hangar decks, mechanics worked amid the thunder of engines and the reek of fuel and oil. Aircraft were being refueled, bombs hoisted into place, guns loaded. The smell of gasoline was nothing unusual in such an environment, and few paid it extra attention. Ventilation fans whirred in the background, moving the air through ducts that ran the length of the ship. What no one realized was that they were carrying the vapor far from the point of impact, into compartments and machinery spaces that had been untouched by the blast. In the damage control center, officers debated whether to halt flight operations for a thorough inspection. Reports from below indicated the leak was contained, though fumes persisted. Time was pressing. Ozawa's battle plan required a constant stream of aircraft in the air to strike at the American fleet. Halting operations now could mean losing the initiative. Orders were given to maintain the pace. Hours passed, and the tension of battle remained high. Taihō's combat air patrols tangled with American Hellcats far to the east, while the first waves of Japanese strike aircraft searched the open ocean for targets. Below decks, the atmosphere grew increasingly volatile. Vapors pooled in low spaces and seeped into electrical compartments, invisible but saturating the air. The armored flight deck above kept the ship safe from bombs, but it also sealed the hangars, trapping heat and slowing the dissipation of fumes. By midday, some compartments were reporting eye-watering stench and lightheaded crewmen. Damage control parties rigged additional ventilation hoses, believing they were making the ship safer. In reality, they were feeding a dangerous mix of fuel vapor and air into a pressurized bomb waiting for a spark. The machinery of war, spinning electric motors, the click of relays, the glow of instrument panels, provided countless potential igniters. Above, the view remained deceptively calm. The deck crews continued their relentless cycle of arming, launching, and recovering aircraft. Gunners stood ready at their 25mm mounts, scanning for any hint of an American airstrike. On the bridge, Ozawa could see his escorts maneuvering in formation, their wakes curling white against the blue sea. He could not see what was happening below, where the ship's fate was already sealed. The torpedo from USS Albacore had not crippled Taihō in the way a commander might expect. There was no great hole flooding her innards, no cascade of fires sweeping her decks. Instead, the weapon had left behind something more treacherous. Time. Time for the fumes to spread, for routine procedures to magnify the danger, and for every man aboard to go about his duties unaware that a single spark could turn the entire ship into a furnace. By early afternoon, the air in certain passageways had grown heavy and flammable, though no alarm had been raised. Orders still flowed smoothly from the flag bridge, aircraft still thundered down the deck into the sky, and the flagship still cut her path through the Philippine Sea with apparent strength. It would take only a moment, one flash, one mechanical slip, to transform that strength into ruin. The clock, though invisible, was already ticking toward disaster. The hours after the torpedo strike were deceptive. From a distance, Taihō looked untouched, her great hull still knifing through the Philippine Sea at over 30 knots, her flight deck alive with the constant motion of launching and recovering aircraft. To an observer watching from one of her escorts, she appeared every bit the flagship of the Mobile fleet, steady, fast, unbroken. The damage control teams had reported the flooding localized and under control, the list corrected, the engines responsive. The mood on the bridge was taut, but far from despairing. In the minds of most aboard, the hit had been weathered. Below decks, reality was far more complex. The torpedo had ruptured several aviation fuel tanks and pipelines. These were not simply storage drums. They were integrated into the structure of the ship, double-hulled and buried deep within her armored vitals. In theory, the protective bulkheads around them were designed to prevent fuel from spreading. In practice, the force of the explosion had sprung seams, buckled plating, and driven fuel into void spaces that were never meant to hold it. From there, it seeped into bilges, maintenance ducts, and cable runs, mixing with seawater in some compartments and pooling freely in others. The most dangerous element was not the liquid itself, but the vapor it released. Gasoline vapors are heavier than air. They collect in the lowest parts of a ship and creep outward in unseen tendrils. The blast had forced vapor into the ventilation ducts, and with the ship's systems still fully operational, those ducts were actively circulating air through nearly every major compartment. Damage control officers, smelling the fumes, ordered additional ventilation, more fans, more open dampers, more airflow. In a wooden-decked carrier, where hangar spaces were open to the elements, this might have dispersed the hazard into the sky. In Taihō's sealed, armored hangars, it had the opposite effect. The vapor spread farther, faster, and more evenly throughout the ship. By mid-morning, the hangar decks were saturated with the smell. The upper hangar, bathed in artificial light under its steel canopy, bustled with activity as mechanics prepared the next strike group. The air was hot, made heavier by exhaust from aircraft engines being warmed up for launch. Many of the younger crewmen ignored the odor entirely. On a carrier, fuel smells were part of the job. Some even welcomed the moving air from the ventilation fans, believing it a sign the damage was being handled. A few veterans felt unease. They remembered the lessons passed down after Midway, when rumors spread that fuel vapors had contributed to the rapid destruction of Japan's earlier carriers. But the armored deck above them was a constant reassurance. Taihō was different. She had been built to survive. In the engineering spaces, the smell was fainter but persistent. Vapor-laden air from the hangars was drawn down into machinery rooms through shared ventilation trunks. The big turbines and auxiliary generators churned on without a hitch, their casings hot to the touch. Electric motors spun, pumps thudded, and relay switches clicked under the hands of engineers monitoring gauges. No one thought of them as potential sources of ignition. They were the lifeblood of the ship, and they had to run. Throughout the ship, gunnery crews manned their positions. The 100mm dual-purpose mounts and the 25mm automatic cannons were kept trained skyward, scanning for American aircraft. Lookouts squinted into the bright haze of the upper atmosphere, reporting contrails in the distance that might be friendly, might be hostile. The psychological weight of being in a fleet battle pressed on everyone, eyes flicking between the empty horizon and the spaces where dangers might appear in seconds. For now, the enemy above was distant. The enemy below was silent. In the damage control center, reports arrived irregularly. Teams in gas masks checked compartments, noting which spaces were clear, which smelled strongly, and which were becoming uninhabitable. More fans were rigged, ducts rerouted, hatches opened. The ship's internal communications carried short, clipped exchanges. Vent line 3 to port. Open the aft bulkhead vent to number 2 hangar. Clear the bilge in frame 98. Each adjustment was meant to dilute the fumes, yet the readings, taken with handheld chemical detectors, showed no significant reduction in concentration. In some compartments, the measurements were climbing. The problem lay in the ship's very design. Taihō's armored deck, hailed as her great advantage, trapped heat and fumes inside the hangars. There were no open sides through which vapor could escape into the wind. Instead, the air was forced to circulate through enclosed ducts, each leading to some other enclosed space. Where earlier carriers could, in an emergency, vent hangars directly to the open sky, Taihō had no such option without halting all operations and disassembling parts of her structure, a step no commander in mid-battle would take. As the hours passed, the concentration of vapors reached the point where men in enclosed spaces began to feel lightheaded. In one compartment near the forward hangar, a petty officer ordered his team to take short breaks on the weather deck, just to get fresh air. In another, a young mechanic coughed continuously, but refused to leave his post at an aircraft fuel pump, insisting the ship needed the plane ready for the next sortie. The flag bridge remained focused on the larger battle. Radio intercepts and spot reports painted a picture of scattered engagements to the east, where Japanese strike waves clashed with the American combat air patrol. Ozawa's concern was maintaining enough aircraft in the air to cover both offense and defense. From his vantage point, the damage from the torpedo hit seemed to have been contained. The ship still answered her helm, still kept speed, still launched planes. What he could not see was that every launch, every revving engine, every electrical circuit was adding another potential ignition source to a ship slowly filling with explosive air. On the escorts, watch officers could see nothing amiss except the slight sheen of oil trailing in Taihō's wake. The great carrier looked as she had that morning, powerful and composed. No one outside her steel hull had reason to think she was a drifting powder keg. Inside, the tension was growing. Among the damage control teams, there was a quiet awareness that the problem was not going away. The air in the hangars was oppressive, the heat building with each passing hour. Every spark from a tool, every flicker from a faulty light fixture, every backfire from an aircraft engine was now a hazard that could ignite the entire space. And still, the orders came to keep operating, keep fueling, keep arming. The clock was running, though no one knew the exact time left. The chemistry of gasoline vapor and air is unforgiving. Once the concentration reaches the right ratio, a single spark is all that is needed. Taihō had crossed that invisible threshold sometime in the late morning. From that moment on, she was no longer a warship fighting in the Philippine Sea. She was a bomb, primed and waiting. On the deck, the sound of an A6M0's engine backfiring drew a glance from more than one crewman. In the hangar below, a mechanic brushed a hand across his brow and smelled the gasoline on his skin. In the engineering spaces, a motor's brushes sparked faintly as it cycled. None of these moments, taken alone, seemed catastrophic. Together, they existed in a suspended state of danger, like the air before a summer thunderstorm, charged, waiting, inevitable. Hours after the torpedo hit, Taihō was still the proud centerpiece of the Mobile fleet. But every minute that passed made her less a fortress and more a trap for the thousands of men aboard. The sea around her was empty of enemies, yet her death was already inside her steel walls, moving silently through the same ducts that carried the ship's lifeblood of air. The only question was when the spark would come. The afternoon sun hung high over the Philippine Sea, burning through a haze that shimmered above the water. By 14:30, Taihō had been underway for nearly 7 hours since the torpedo strike. From the outside, she remained an imposing sight, her armored bow slicing cleanly through the blue, her flight deck orderly and active. Inside, however, the very air had become her greatest enemy. The gasoline vapors, now thoroughly mixed with the ship's internal atmosphere, had reached a concentration so perfect for combustion that it needed nothing more than the smallest ignition to set the entire carrier ablaze. The moment itself was instantaneous, almost too quick to register as it happened. Somewhere deep within the ship, accounts would later point to the forward hangar. An electric motor switched on, a contact arced, or an aircraft engine coughed to life. That single spark leapt into the air, invisible and unnoticed, but it was enough. In a fraction of a second, the spark met the vapor-air mixture and the chemical reaction detonated. The explosion began as a violent, concussive flash that ripped through the forward hangar deck. The shock wave compressed the air so rapidly that it forced bulkheads outward and tore through welds. Steel doors that had been dogged tight blew from their frames. The blast raced along the hangar, igniting any pocket of vapor it touched, feeding itself on the thousands of gallons of fuel now atomized into a combustible mist. In the enclosed armored space, the energy had nowhere to go but sideways and down, slamming into compartments and tearing upward through lifts and hatches. Men nearest the blast were thrown from their feet before they even knew what had happened. Some vanished entirely into the white-orange glare, consumed by the initial fireball. Others were hurled against bulkheads or machinery with bone-breaking force. In the engineering spaces below, the lights flickered and then died as circuits were severed. The air filled with a deafening roar, like 100 trains rushing through a tunnel, punctuated by the secondary explosions of ammunition cooking off in lockers and aircraft ordnance igniting where it lay secured under wings. On the flight deck, crewmen felt the deck heave beneath them, a sudden upward lurch followed by a sickening heel to starboard. A sheet of flame belched from the forward elevator well, reaching for the sky in a twisting column of black smoke and burning debris. The shockwave swept across the deck, knocking down men who had been guiding aircraft into position. In seconds, the neat lines of machinery and aircraft were chaos. Fighters toppled on their noses, carts overturned, bombs rolling free, fuel hoses whipping about as their fittings tore loose. From the flag bridge, Ozawa could see the plume, dense, oily smoke curling high, blotting the sun, and the damage amidships. Even at that distance from the source, the concussion had rattled the bridge windows. His first thought was of another torpedo, but the reports coming in over the internal communications told a different story. Massive explosion in the hangar, fires spreading rapidly, multiple compartments breached. The list to starboard was growing, slow but unmistakable. The damage control parties were already moving, dragging hoses toward the worst of the flames. But the explosion had gutted key sections of the ship's internal structure. The armored hangar that had been designed to protect her instead acted like a blast chamber, containing and reflecting the heat back into the ship. Water poured onto the flames, hissed into clouds of steam, scalding men at the nozzles. In the compartments below, smoke filled the air, thick and acrid, making breathing impossible without masks. Visibility dropped to nothing in some passageways, and the glow of flames illuminated twisted steel where decks had buckled. Secondary blasts continued to shake the hull, small detonations from ready-use ammunition lockers, the pop of fuel drums, the sharp, flat crack of oxygen bottles bursting under heat. The noise was unrelenting. The roar of the fire, the wail of alarms, the shouted orders barely audible over it all. The heat was so intense in some sections of the hangar that the paint blistered and peeled from the bulkheads, curling away in blackened strips. On the flight deck, the last of the armed aircraft were hastily shoved toward the edges, some jettisoned overboard to prevent them from becoming airborne bombs. Aircraft handlers worked in pairs, their uniforms soaked with sweat, the air around them shimmering with heat. The decision to abandon attempts at further flight operations came quickly. There would be no more launching from Taihō. The deck was now a battlefield in its own right. Ozawa conferred briefly with his staff. It was clear within minutes that the ship's operational capacity was gone. Communications to some sections were cut entirely. Steering was still functioning, but the growing list made high-speed maneuvering dangerous. The fires were out of control forward, and now reports came in of structural damage threatening the integrity of the hangar deck supports. The flagship was dying, and the admiral could not afford to die with her, not with the battle still raging across hundreds of miles of sea. Orders went out for a destroyer to come alongside. Ozawa gathered his charts, his signals staff, and a few personal effects, and prepared to transfer his flag to Zuikaku. The destroyer's approach was made against a backdrop of chaos. The smell of burning fuel rolled across the water, acrid and choking. Black smoke poured from the forward third of the carrier, rising in thick columns visible for miles. On the weather decks, crewmen fought the fires with hoses, buckets, anything they could find, while others lowered stretchers bearing men burned or broken by the blast. When Ozawa's party crossed to the destroyer, they did so under the watch of hundreds of their shipmates still struggling aboard Taihō. The admiral glanced back at the carrier that had been meant to be his shield in battle, now listing harder, her graceful lines marred by smoke and jagged holes in her flanks. His jaw was set, but the loss was unmistakable. Below decks, the situation was deteriorating. Flooding from ruptured fire mains and cooling systems began to mix with the heat, sending jets of steam into already unlivable compartments. Entire sections were cut off, men trapped inside. The ship's medical teams worked without pause, their makeshift stations overflowing. Some survivors stumbled topside with their uniforms smoldering, eyes wide from shock, their faces blackened with soot. Others emerged supporting comrades too injured to walk, their boots slipping on wet steel slick with fuel. By late afternoon, the list had increased to more than 10 degrees, and the fires still raged uncontrollably. The sea lapped higher along the starboard side, waves slapping into the open wounds in her hull. On the port side, crew began preparing lifeboats and rafts. The order to abandon ship came reluctantly, passed from the bridge to the remaining officers. The bugle calls that once signaled the launch of aircraft now heralded the evacuation of the vessel. Men began going over the side, some climbing down ropes into the waiting boats of the escorts, others simply leaping into the sea, the cooler embrace of the water preferable to the inferno behind them. Oil slicks spread from the carrier's wounds, rainbow sheens over the water that clung to skin and clothes. Destroyers closed in to pick up swimmers, their decks filling rapidly with the rescued. Even as she was evacuated, Taihō remained afloat for the moment, her great armored deck sagging slightly amidships, her once proud bow riding higher than the stern. Fires still burned within her, glowing in the open wounds along her starboard flank. She was no longer the striking spearhead of the Mobile fleet, just a gutted, smoking hulk. By the time Ozawa was safely aboard Zuikaku, the decision had been made to leave her to her fate. There would be no towing, no saving. The sea would claim her, as it had so many of her sisters. In the waters around her, the survivors clung to rafts and debris, some watching silently, others unable to look back. The battle in the skies continued far to the east, but here, the fight was over. Taihō's final hours had begun with the promise of her survival. They would end in fire, smoke, and the slow roll of a great ship succumbing to the weight of her own wounds. The torpedo had struck in the morning. By late afternoon, the spark had done its work. The flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force was mortally wounded, and the Philippine Sea would soon close over her. ChatGPT said, "By the late afternoon of June 19th, the flagship of the Japanese mobile fleet was no longer a warship in any meaningful sense. Taihō, once the embodiment of Japan's faith in a new era of carrier warfare, now drifted crippled in the Philippine Sea, her engines silenced, her armored deck sagging in places where the internal supports had been buckled by the explosion. Smoke still curled from gaping rents in her starboard side, each plume rising lazily in the humid air, before flattening into the layered cloud ceiling overhead. The list to starboard had grown worse. Where in the first hour after the blast she leaned only gently, now her hull slanted at more than 15 degrees, the deck edge dipping dangerously close to the sea. The bow, heavy with flooding from multiple compartments, rode lower than the stern, giving her profile a slight but unmistakable downward tilt. Waves slapped rhythmically against the side, each one sending a faint shiver through the wounded giant. The great carrier was dying, and everyone still aboard could feel it. On the weather deck, the evacuation was in full motion. Lines were rigged over the port side, the higher, drier flank of the listing hull. Destroyers and smaller escorts edged in cautiously, their own decks crowded with the rescued from earlier lifts. The sea between ships was a dangerous place, slick with fuel oil, littered with floating debris, and swarming with men in kapok life jackets calling out for help. Some clung to wooden planks or ammunition crates, their faces barely above the water. Others, too weak to swim, drifted on the oil until a boat hook or rope found them. Chief Petty Officer Nishida, stationed near the after 100mm mount when the explosion hit, remembered climbing through choking smoke and heat to reach the open deck. His last moments aboard were spent helping lift an injured shipmate, both legs burned and useless, over the rail to a rope ladder leading down to a waiting cutter. "We had trained to fight the ship," he would later say, "but when the ship became the fire, there was nothing left to fight for." Inside, a handful of officers and senior petty officers made the final rounds of damage assessment. Lieutenant Commander Sato, one of the ship's engineering officers, picked his way through knee-deep water in the starboard engine room, flashlight beam bouncing off twisted metal and floating debris. He noted the rising waterline on bulkheads, the ominous groan of shifting structure overhead. In his report to the bridge, relayed by the few still functioning sound-powered phones, he said simply, "Structural failure imminent. Recommend immediate abandonment." The order to abandon ship had already been given in practice, if not in formal announcement. Lifeboats and cutters moved constantly between Taihō and her escorts, shuttling survivors across the narrowing stretch of water. On the destroyer Hatsuzuki, sailors reached down to pull aboard men so coated in black oil that only their eyes and teeth showed white against the grime. Some came in coughing, retching up seawater and fuel. Others collapsed silently where they fell, their energy spent in the effort of staying alive. The ship's doctor set up a triage area on the fantail, the deck already streaked with boot prints in oil and blood. From the bridge of Zuikaku, now Ozawa's flagship, the view was almost surreal. Less than 24 hours earlier, Taihō had sailed at the heart of the fleet formation, her hull clean, her lines sharp, her flight deck a parade ground of ordered discipline. Now she drifted alone in a widening gap, the smell of burning metal and fuel heavy even at this distance. Her once proud silhouette was marred by smoke, bent steel, and the steady downward creep of her bow. The admiral watched without expression, but those nearby could sense the weight of the moment. Japan's most advanced carrier, lost not to an overwhelming air assault, but to a single torpedo and the chain of failures that followed. In the water, the situation was grim. The oil slick clung to everything, making it nearly impossible to grip ropes or ladders. Swimmers' eyes burned from the fumes, their throats raw from coughing. Some clung to their rescuers in panic, nearly pulling them under. Others floated quietly, exhaustion having stripped away even fear. The sea itself seemed to conspire against them. Small swells washed survivors into the carrier's side, where barnacles tore skin and clothing. A group of stokers from the forward boiler room, their faces blackened, swam together toward a drifting wooden pallet. They formed a rough circle, pushing the weakest into the center to rest on the makeshift raft. Each time a destroyer's launch came near, they waved weakly, shouting if they had the strength. Back aboard Taihō, the last men were leaving. Some officers lingered to oversee the evacuation, their voices hoarse from smoke, their white gloves smeared with soot and fuel. The final ship's log entry was scrawled hastily, recording the time, position, and state of the ship for the record. Down below, in compartments now fully open to the sea, the cold water rushed in unchecked, surging over machinery and through jagged openings where bulkheads had failed. The sound was like a slow, unstoppable sigh. By 1700, the carrier's forward deck edge was nearly level with the water. The list increased rapidly as trapped air pockets escaped in great bubbling bursts from the starboard side. A low moan ran through her hull as the stresses of flooding overcame the strength of her internal frames. The escorts had pulled back a little, wary of the suction when she finally went under. At 1725, she began her final descent. The bow dipped sharply, shipping green water over the forward third of the flight deck. Men still in the water shouted and splashed to get clear. The stern rose slowly at first, then more rapidly, her twin screws lifting into the air, dark with oil and streaked with rust from the battle's violence. The black smoke still poured from the midsection, a last defiant signal to the empty sky. Seawater cascaded down the length of the deck as Taihō slid forward into the depths. The sound was a deep, rolling rumble that grew louder until, at 1732, the stern slipped beneath the surface, the screws vanishing in a boil of foam. The water closed over her with a final, almost gentle hiss. The sea swelled and rippled, then began to settle, leaving only an expanding oil slick and scattered wreckage to mark where she had been. In her wake, more than 1,600 men were gone, trapped below, lost in the initial explosion, drowned in the chaos of the final minutes. The survivors, numbering fewer than 1,000, floated among the debris or huddled on the decks of their rescuers. Some stared blankly at the slick where their ship had been, as if expecting her to rise again. Others looked away, unwilling to watch the last traces of her vanish beneath the waves. For those who had seen her leave port only days earlier, the contrast was almost unbearable. Then, she had been a symbol of resilience and ingenuity, a promise that Japan could still produce a carrier to match the might of the Essex class. Now she was another name in the roll of sunken ships, her armored deck and modern systems undone by a single well-placed strike and the fatal mistakes that followed. As night fell over the Philippine Sea, the oil slick spread wider, reflecting the dying light in shimmering, iridescent colors. The battle still raged far to the east, but here the fight was over. The sea had taken Taihō, as it had taken so many before her, and the Mobile fleet would never be the same. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had been conceived by Japan's Naval High Command as the decisive blow that would halt the American advance across the Central Pacific. In the minds of its planners, the Mobile fleet, centered around 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and the last concentration of Japan's trained naval aviators, would lure the U.S. Fifth Fleet into range, smash its carriers with long-range strikes, and restore the strategic balance. By the evening of June 19, 1944, that vision lay in ruins. The day's air battles had ended with staggering Japanese losses in what American pilots would christen the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese carrier aircraft had been shot down, most by radar-directed Hellcats, before they could even reach their targets. The loss of Taihō added a cruel punctuation mark to this defeat. She had been Japan's most modern carrier, the first with an armored flight deck, the ship intended to shield the Mobile fleet's heart. Instead, she had been sunk in her first battle by a single torpedo from a submarine that had never even been spotted. For U.S. submarine forces, her destruction was a vindication of a strategy that had been steadily tightening the noose on Japan since 1942. Aggressive, coordinated patrol lines placed in the likely paths of enemy task forces. The attack by USS Albacore, executed in the opening hours of the battle, was exactly what the doctrine demanded. Hit high-value targets, withdraw, and let the enemy's formation and morale unravel. For the Imperial Navy, the blow was more than material. Taihō represented years of scarce industrial resources, skilled labor, and strategic hope. Her loss on the very day she entered combat was not the result of overwhelming American firepower, but of a failure in shipboard damage control. Ventilation procedures that meant to save her instead spread lethal gasoline vapors throughout her hull. The irony was bitter. The armor that had been designed to make her invulnerable to air attack had turned her hangars into sealed chambers, ideal for the accumulation of explosive gases. A flaw in design, compounded by inexperience with armored deck carriers, and an unwillingness to halt flight operations long enough to vent the ship to open air, had doomed her as surely as the torpedo itself. In the Japanese command's official communiques, the loss of Taihō was omitted or vaguely alluded to, masked by euphemisms about damage and temporary withdrawal. The truth was tightly controlled, even from much of the fleet. Only those in the Mobile fleet and certain staff circles knew the full extent of the disaster. In Japan itself, the press made no mention of the carrier's fate, and survivors returning home were instructed not to speak of it. The nation's propaganda machinery could not admit that its newest and most advanced warship had been destroyed in her first engagement, not when morale was already fragile after years of attrition. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, knew exactly what had been achieved. Post-battle intelligence pieced together from submarine reports and intercepted Japanese communications confirmed that a major carrier had been sunk early in the fight. The Navy's official assessment hailed it as a triumph of submarine operations, underscoring the growing lethality of the undersea fleet. In public, however, the sinking was only one part of the larger narrative, the crushing of Japanese carrier aviation over the Marianas. Strategically, the battle, and Taihō's loss within it, was a turning point from which Japan's carrier arm would never recover. The destruction of hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and the pilots to fly them left the surviving Japanese carriers as little more than empty shells. They could still sail, but without trained air groups, they were carriers in name only. Taihō's end was a symbol of this larger collapse, a powerful hull without the operational depth to use its potential, undone by internal weaknesses the enemy never had to exploit directly. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. Submarines were not merely commerce raiders. They were fleet assets capable of striking decisive blows in major naval engagements. The sinking of Taihō, along with the loss of the carrier Shokaku to USS Kavala later the same day, proved that a well-placed submarine screen could inflict catastrophic damage on an enemy task force, even before the main surface or air battle was joined. For Japan, the shock was felt most acutely within the officer corps. The armored carrier concept had seemed a leap forward in survivability, Yet Taihō's destruction revealed how little experience the Imperial Navy had in managing such ships under combat damage conditions. Training for damage control had focused on firefighting and flooding, but not on the unique dangers of fuel vapor in sealed hangars. The decisions made aboard Taihō that morning, especially the choice to increase ventilation in the belief it would make the ship safer, were rooted in conventional practice. On a steel-roofed carrier with closed sides, those same practices became lethal. In the months that followed, the loss of Taihō became a quiet, cautionary tale among those who knew of it. In naval colleges and staff briefings, the lesson was framed not as a condemnation of her crew, but as a warning about doctrine, that technology without the experience to wield it could be as dangerous to its owner as to its enemy. For the sailors who had served aboard her, there was little comfort in that. They had watched their ship sink, taking more than 1,600 of their shipmates into the depths. Many of those survivors would be assigned to other carriers that, by late 1944, would themselves be lost in battles where the Japanese air arm could offer only token resistance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would be remembered by the United States as one of the most lopsided carrier battles in history, a day when the enemy's air arm was virtually annihilated and 2 of its fleet carriers sent to the bottom. In Japan, where its true scope could not be openly discussed, it was a silent marker of the war's turning tide, an event whose consequences would ripple outward until the end of the conflict. And at the center of that tide was the story of Taihō, a ship that had promised resilience but delivered only a reminder that in war, strength is nothing without the skill to safeguard it. The Philippine Sea is vast and deep, a rolling expanse of blue that conceals its dead with ease. Somewhere beneath its surface, in waters more than 4,000 meters down, the remains of Taihō lie in darkness. The wreck has never been found, its exact position known only from the final signals sent before she slipped beneath the waves on June 19, 1944. Down there, the light fades to nothing within a few hundred feet. Below that, the silence is absolute. What was once the most advanced aircraft carrier Japan ever built rests in the cold mud. Her armored flight deck collapsed inward, her hull torn by explosion and implosion alike. For decades after the war, she existed in memory only, in official records, in the logbooks of her escorts, and in the stories carried home by her survivors. Many of those men would speak sparingly of the day. In interviews decades later, a few recalled the sensory details that never left them. The metallic tang of fuel in the air before the blast, the strange stillness after the initial concussion, the smell of burning oil as they clung to debris. Others remembered the pride they'd felt when they first walked her decks, steel smooth under the sun, the gold chrysanthemum crest bright at her bow, and the bitter disbelief that such a ship could be lost so quickly. For the crew of USS Albacore, Taihō's destruction was a moment of triumph, though they would not know the full extent of their success until much later. The submarine completed her patrol and returned to port, credited with the sinking of a major enemy carrier. In time, she would claim more Japanese ships, each patrol adding to her tally. But her own fate would mirror those of her victims. On her 11th war patrol in November 1944, while operating off Hokkaido, Albacore struck a mine and was lost with all hands. Today, she too lies on the seabed, an unmarked grave far from home. In the post-war years, the story of Taihō became an object lesson for naval architects and strategists. She had embodied the Imperial Japanese Navy's response to the disasters of Midway. Armor for survivability, compartmentalization for damage control, modern systems to keep her in the fight. Yet her destruction showed the limits of design when doctrine and training lagged behind technology. The armored deck that was meant to shield her from bombs had sealed in the fumes that would ignite and destroy her. The decision to maintain flight operations at all costs, rooted in the idea that a carrier's primary weapon was its aircraft, had created the conditions for her loss. In this way, Taihō's brief career was a microcosm of Japan's broader war at sea, ambitious in conception, brave in execution, but undermined by strategic overreach and the inability to replace what was lost. Her sinking also marked a symbolic handover in naval warfare. In 1941 and 1942, it was the carrier that had become the queen of battle, capable of projecting power across oceans. By 1944, in the Philippine Sea, the silent hunter beneath the waves had shown it could kill the queen before she moved a piece on the board. The victory of USS Albacore and her sister boats in the submarine force was not only in tonnage sunk, but in the way they reshaped the battle itself, crippling the Japanese fleet before the first major aerial clash even began. Occasionally, proposals surfaced to locate Taihō's wreck, spurred by advances in deep-sea exploration. But the Philippine Sea is immense, and wartime records can place her last position only within a broad swath of ocean. Until technology or luck brings her into view, she remains a ghost, her exact resting place unknown. For historians, perhaps that is fitting. Taihō was always as much a symbol as she was a ship, her loss less a chapter in naval engineering than a verdict on an entire doctrine of war. Archival film of her launch still exists, the great hull sliding into the water at Kawasaki's Kobe Yard in April 1943, her decks clean, her sides unscarred. In the grainy black and white, workers wave and officials stand stiffly at attention, their faces set with the confidence of a nation that still believed it could control the war's course. Watching now, knowing she would fight only once and be gone within hours, the images take on a different weight. Every line of her hull, every plate of armor, every gun mount was built to endure the storm of battle. Yet it was the air within her, poisoned and primed to explode, that brought her down. In the deep, far from the sunlight she once sailed under, Taihō rests as a relic of that paradox. She was conceived as the carrier that could not be sunk in a day, yet the day she met battle was the day she was lost. And in that loss lies the full measure of the war's turning tide, the twilight of Japan's carrier supremacy, and the quiet, deadly rise of the submarine as the unseen master of the Pacific. When the camera fades on her launch footage, the clean deck, the waving flags, the ship sliding toward the open sea, it does so with the knowledge of her fate already in mind. The cheers and salutes are swallowed by the years, and the image dissolves into the empty horizon of the Philippine Sea. Beneath that surface, in darkness and silence, Taihō endures only as a shape in the mud, a story told by those who survived her and,